Hey everybody, it is your favorite fantasy football addict, Chuck Nasty here. Got a couple things to go over today before we start today's show. We're going to be going into the NFC West, some of the changes that they've made in the offseason, and how it impacts your fantasy football team. Before we get into that, just wanted to go over a couple things. My clothing line, as well as hats, sweatshirts, beanies, and t-shirts actually just dropped in the last couple weeks. I'll put a link to that down in the show notes if you guys are interested in buying anything. If you are, make sure you use code ChuckNastyFam at checkout for a discount. I appreciate all the love and support. But first, welcome back.
I'm back!
Now that we're back, we're going to go over the Los Angeles Rams to start. So starting off, we have pretty much the same roster that we had last year, a couple of additions. Cooper Kupp as a wide receiver, Robert Woods as a wide receiver, Brandon Cooks is still there, Gerald Everett are the primary targets in the passing game. Outside of that, they used a 5th-round pick this year on Darrell Henderson, and we'll go into that in a little bit. If you look at the wide receivers, Robert Woods finished as the wide receiver 10 overall last year in standard formats with 86 receptions for 1,219 yards and 6 touchdowns. Cooks wasn't far behind him at the wide receiver 13 for 80 receptions, 1,204 reception yards, and 5 touchdowns. And then we have the third, Cooper Kupp, dragging a little bit behind. Also had an issue with an ACL, but he finished with 62 receptions for 849 yards and 8.8 TDs. That's kind of where I'm projecting him to go this year. So right now he's the wide receiver 21 off the board. In 2019, I'm projecting him to end up right in the wide receiver 17 to wide receiver 18 range. So he's a pretty good round, a target in the 5th round. Wanted to go over the Todd Gurley the issue with his injury a little bit as well. Everybody knows that he has an arthritic knee, and some people are really concerned about how that's going to affect his draft stock. There was a couple of reports from Ian Rappaport with NFL that said Gurley's days as an every down bell cow are probably over. He didn't play in OTAs, he didn't play in preseason, and initially when those reports came out, his average draft stock moved back like 3 to 5 spots from 10 to 15. Well, recently, everybody's kind of come to terms with the fact that he still finished as the number 1 overall running back last year and is being drafted as, the running back 9 at like the 11th overall pick. There's been a couple of leagues where I got really, really lucky and ended up snagging him at like 23, which I think is a great value. Even if you take 30 to 40% of his workload off, he still finishes in the top 15 at his position. So I'm not really avoiding Gurley. I'm not reaching for him, but it's just something where if you end up drafting him in those first 2 or 3 rounds and, Darrell Henderson's on the board a bit later, you can grab him. But just make sure that you're going to grab his actual true backup, which is Malcolm Brown, who is currently going off the board as the running back 62 at pick 203. In a lot of leagues, he's not even being drafted. So don't get confused by all the hype around Darrell Henderson. He's not the true backup to Gurley. If Gurley was to go down or it was something that was going to happen to him, Malcolm Brown would see the biggest benefit from that. I want to go over the quarterback situation a little bit as well. Jared Goff, there's some people that are a little bit skeptical on how I'm not sure if it has anything to do with his approach. Maybe they have the Jared Goff of 2 or 3 years ago in their mind. But he has a ton of weapons. And as I went over in a prior video, he is automatically better with Cooper Kupp in the lineup. So when he has Cooper Kupp healthy, he averages 321 yards per game and 2.1 touchdowns. That's 21.1 points per game. That would have finished him in like the top 5 or top 6 quarterbacks last year. He did finish in the top 5 or 6 quarterbacks last year anyways. He finished at the QB 6 last year, but he's currently being drafted as the QB 9. I'm getting a ton of Goff. If I wait a little bit later to draft a quarterback, people are reaching on guys like Mahomes, Rodgers, Baker Mayfield, some of these guys with steeper draft prices. I would wait. I would grab Jared Goff, and if you can stack him with somebody like a Cooper Kupp who's going to get 8 to 9 touchdowns this year, great value. Now that we've covered any concerns or comments on the Rams, if you guys have any specific questions, make sure you leave them in the comments below. But I'm going to go into the Seattle Seahawks next. If you look at how they ran their offense last year, they rushed the ball 534 times. Now, 67 of those was by Russell Wilson himself, so doesn't necessarily benefit the running backs, but they only attempted 427 passes. So what happened in the offseason for them was they had a couple of changes to their offense. Mike Davis was traded. I guess he was released off of their roster and was picked up by the Chicago Bears. He had 112 touches for 34 receptions. All of those will basically be put back into the pot to benefit any combination of Rashad Penny, CJ Prosise, or ultimately Chris Carson. You look at Chris Carson's workload last year, he had 247 carries, 1,054 yards, and 20 receptions for 163 yards with 9 touchdowns. So he finished as the 13th running back overall last year. Personally, I am super high on Chris Carson this year. I think that he just has this killer year. Pete Carroll's actually talked about him having closer to like 40 or 50 receptions, which would be absolutely insane. That would catapult him in PPR formats especially from the 13th running back overall to like top 5, top 6 consideration. So keep that in mind when you're in the 4th round and Chris Carson's hanging around there. Great value pick this year. I like him a lot. You look at Rashad Penny, who is the backup to Chris Carson right now. He is probably somewhere, I would say, mid 150s on carries this year potentially, but he's looked really, really bad in the preseason. There's a couple of quotes. Hasn't looked explosive, has shown nothing as a runner, and he actually, in 2 preseason games ago, he had 13 yards on 12 carries. Awful. Absolutely abysmal performance. I don't want anything to do with Rashad Penny. I think that they invested too much draft capital in him, and at this point, they're running the offense through Chris Carson. You look at the receivers that are or were in Seattle. Previously, Doug Baldwin was there, who has since retired. 73 targets are being vacated from him. Those are potentially available for maybe DK Metcalf, David Moore, or Tyler Lockett. Well, if you look at what's happened so far through the preseason with the Seattle Seahawks, the only problem has been injuries so far. David Moore is currently sidelined with a shoulder injury, and DK Metcalf had a knee scope and is currently day-to-day. So the only receiver you can really count on in the Seattle offense is Tyler Lockett. I like him a lot in the 5th, 6th round area. Last year he finished with 57 receptions on 70 targets for 965 yards and 10 touchdowns. He was probably the most efficient receiver in the NFL last year, which is great. There's more targets available, so you can only see his stock rising. They're probably going to run 2 wide receiver sets that end up with Tyler Lockett and Jerron Brown running out there while the other receivers get healthy. There's a possible that maybe somebody like Gary Jennings fights for a 3rd wide receiver spot if he's out there as well. Not drafting any Jerron Brown, not really fantasy relevant, but do like Tyler Lockett a lot in the 5th, 6th round. Now that we covered the Seahawks, we're going to go into the San Francisco 49ers. Now this one's a little bit less straightforward since there is a ton of running backs there. They initially had 3 starters listed on their roster for a period of time. They had Tevin Coleman, Matt Breida, and then Jerick McKinnon. Well, the good news for us is that everybody that was talking about, they have too many running backs, where's the workload's going to go, Jerick McKinnon had a setback with his injury and is potentially looking at being placed on IR, which kind of narrows the scope of your fantasy picks down a little bit. Tevin Coleman slated to get the majority of the work. Matt Breida would be probably the second primary passing down back there as well. Coleman can catch passes, so it might be closer to a 50-50 split. We don't really know yet. The preseason eye test of watching a couple of those games, Matt Breida had a couple of really, really good receptions. He also had a goal line target into the end zone that he ended up catching for a touchdown. So of those guys, I mean, if you're in the 6th or 7th round, Tevin Coleman's probably going to be available, and he's probably going to lead the backfield. They obviously showed that they wanted him on that roster, giving him a 2-year, $10 million contract. But if I was drafting any of these 2 guys, I'm probably aiming for somebody like Matt Breida in that 10th round. He's currently the 41st running back off the board. And, if something happens to Tevin Coleman, you have a plug-and-play RB1. The wide receiving core is even more of a mess. You have Trent Taylor, Deebo Samuel, Dante Pettis, Jordan Matthews, Marquise Goodwin, and Jalen Hurd all listed on their roster. It's been kind of a bit of a muddy situation through camp because they said, Dante Pettis has to earn his spot, and he's been playing a ton of snaps. And then you have other guys where you're just really not sure how the targets are going to be spread out. I'm not really drafting a ton of those guys. The only target that I want in San Fran, which is probably going to be no surprise to you, is George Kittle. I really don't have any idea who's going to start behind Kittle. And, Marquise Goodwin was the primary target for Jimmy Garoppolo prior to his ACL injury. So there could be a chance that you end up everybody drafts Dante Pettis, and then Marquise Goodwin comes out of the woodwork and is the primary target there behind George Kittle. I don't know, so I'm not going to risk any draft picks on it. I really have a feeling that, and it's pretty much a no-brainer, it's not as much of a feeling, but George Kittle is going to lead the team in receptions. He had 136 targets in 2018. I only think that number goes up from here. Now that we've got the 49ers knocked out, we'll go to the last team in the NFC West, the Arizona Cardinals. So there's been some additional changes to their team, pretty big changes that could definitely impact the state of their offense. Primarily, they traded Josh Rosen to Miami with the 62nd overall pick, and they used that to grab Andy Isabella, a slot receiver. They also drafted Kyler Murray, number 1 overall, and switched up their entire coaching staff to bring in Cliff Kingsbury from Texas Tech. Where Kyler Murray is going currently, he's pretty much in that 10 to 13th quarterback off the board range. And there was a couple of stats that other fantasy analysts had posted that actually had him being the top number 1 overall quarterback that finished in various metrics coming out of college to transition into the NFL. So I'm not talking about specific draft day combine stats or anything like that, but overall success rate. He even tested higher than Baker Mayfield. So it's worth a flyer in that spot. You can always back him up with somebody like Josh Allen or somebody a little bit later in the draft that'll allow you to have kind of that safety net behind him, but his legs are going to grant you a pretty high floor for him as a fantasy option. So if you're in a 4-point pass touchdown versus 6-point pass touchdown, I guess it really changes things a little bit, but for the most part, he's a better runner than Baker Mayfield. So their passing game's pretty similar. I like Kyler a lot. The receiving game is a little bit more murky. So they have Andy Isabella, who they drafted. They have Akeem Butler, who they drafted. They have the legacy himself in Larry Fitzgerald. And then they have an up-and-coming rookie who kind of broke out last year, Christian Kirk. Big fan of Christian Kirk, where he's currently being drafted. Isabella being a good receiver in the slot might take some work away from him, but it's really hard to say. I think that Kirk's primarily going to play more outside. And then you also have Michael Crabtree, who just recently got signed over there as well. So all that does is provide more weapons for Kyler to be a better fantasy option for you. If I'm drafting any of these guys, I'm drafting Larry Fitzgerald in PPR formats and maybe Christian Kirk as like an upside guy, depending on my roster construction in a standard format. The only last piece that some people have had some questions on and reached out to me is, where do I see David Johnson being this year? The prior offense did him a huge disservice. He hurt a lot of people last year, and people felt like they were burned by him, so they're not drafting him in that top 5 or top 6 range where he should be going. Last year he finished with 258 rushes and 940 yards for 7 touchdowns, and he added another 50 receptions for 446 yards and 3 touchdowns. He finished at the 10th overall running back. Ultimately, Cliff Kingsbury is going to allow Kyler and this team to spread out the offense a lot more. The biggest positive about having not a very good O-line is that they're not going to have the option of running David Johnson straight up the seam like they have in the past. So if he can get into the game as more of a receiver and then even go a bit more laterally in some scenarios, he's going to benefit a ton more than he did last year. I currently have him projected at a pretty similar workload, but he gets an additional 200 yards in the rush game and an additional 100 yards in the receiving game. So as long as his touchdown numbers stay pretty much the same, he's going to finish inside like the top 7 running backs this year. I even have him finishing like top 5. So I think he's a pretty safe pick if you're in that 4th, 5th spot and you don't want to risk anything with the Ezekiel situation. I wouldn't mind grabbing him in that spot at all. That's pretty much all we've got for today, guys. I'm going to follow this up with each individual division and all the changes that they've made. I will also leave the link to the Chuck Nasty store for apparel in the show notes. And if you guys have any questions at all, make sure you leave a comment, drop a subscription on here, and be notified the next time you've got some more fancy content. I hope your drafts are going well. Have a good day.
Guess we'll see you around.
All right, check you later.